Hi, today I'm going to talk about how to design and make this Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild wall quilt. Hi, welcome to Gray Lightning, my video blog about making things and playing games. And in this episode I am going to talk about how I made this Breath of the Wild wall quilt. Now, to make this project requires no special equipment other than a sewing machine with basic sewing stitches. This central motif here is the shrine. There's 120 shrines in the game. I just finished my first playthrough, 110 hours, and I grew to love the shrines, so I wanted to make something with the shrine in it. I did do the drawing first in Adobe Illustrator, but you could also use CorelDRAW, or you could use Inkscape, which is free. I used my drawing in a laser cutter to cut out acrylic templates. But you don't have to do that. You could send your drawing to Kinko's or Staples and cut it out of cardstock, and that would work fine too. And as I said, no fancy sewing, no machine embroidery, just basic stitches. So all you need for this project is a certain amount of patience and some know-how, and I'm going to share that know-how with you today. My drawings always start with a reference photo, and this is my main one. It's a screenshot from the game. But you see part of the base is missing here, so I have a second reference shot to fill in the details on the base. I have other videos that are in-depth tutorials for Illustrator, but I'll give you an overview here of my process. I put all the main elements on different layers. So for example, this is the outline of the shrine. I do the outline first, and then I go ahead and fill that in with a fill so that I can simulate what the picture is going to look like. Complex shapes like this I do using the pen tool. That's what I did to make the base, which is this next layer here. These steps are done using the ellipse shape tool and the pathfinder tool. And the opening here I did using the pen tool. And these are ellipses, the glowing blue pads. The sheikah console is an ellipse and a pen-drawn shape. And these stony growths on the outside of the shrine, I just called them noodles. I don't know what they really are, but they have a blue light that glows inside of them. And that blue light turns out to be the most difficult part of my drawing and my actual quilt. The noodles are also drawn using the pen tool. And then the last layers here are this sheikah motif at the top, these little constellations, and of course Link himself. The sheikah motif I did the same way I did the divine beasts. I found a black and white image like this and I did an image trace. And the constellations I just drew using circles and lines. Then I created a new Illustrator drawing for the quilt itself. Link had to be 2 inches tall, so the center block is 20 by 20 inches and the overall quilt is 3 feet by 3 feet. Now I need to draw the templates themselves. One thing I want to mention that's an advantage of the laser cutter over cutting these by hand, and that's that you get both parts of the design, the positive and the negative. So for example, sometimes you use the positive to trace on the material and cut it out and applique it. But sometimes you use the negative, like a stencil, to draw on the background material and then use thread to embroider inside of it. And in some cases, I would use both pieces. So in a complicated design like this with a lot of little pieces, I'd use the positive to cut out all those little pieces, but then I would use this and draw inside of it to get the layout of those little pieces. And that gave me perfect accuracy. The bed of my laser cutter is 18 by 24 inches, so that's the size of these drawings. I laid out the positive for some pieces, but in cases where I thought I could use both the positive and the negative, I'd put a rectangle around it so I would get that stencil. Because of the large size of some of the pieces, it takes 3 sheets of acrylic to cut all the pieces. And I'm using 1/8 inch clear acrylic, and sometimes I peel the paper off the back after cutting, but mostly I leave it on so that I can tell the right side from the wrong side. In the end, these are very simple vector drawings and they cut very quickly. So here's the basic applique process used in this quilt. I'm going to cut out my fabric, I'm going to fuse it to the background, and I'm going to stitch around it. You're going to see that this process reverses the image, and that's why it's important to always put the wrong side up as you trace the shapes onto something called Pellin's Wonder Under. This is a double-sided fusible interfacing you draw on the paper of one side, and then you fuse it to the fabric and use a dry heat to do that. You have to do it long enough that the paper turns kind of a parchment look, and that will tell you that it's actually fused to the fabric below. And then you cut those pieces out. Now I used my stencil to lay it on the background fabric and use a contrasting fabric pencil. Here I used white. And then you peel the paper backing off the pieces, you lay them in place, and then you fuse those by using, in this case, a wet heat, a steam iron, and it fuses very nicely to the fabric below. That's going to hold it in place while I stitch it. Now you don't want to do heavy stitching on just a single layer of fabric, so you put what's called a stabilizer on the back, and I just pin that in place. And then I use what's called a blanket stitch to stitch along the edge, and you see it laps over the edge of the applique, and I'm using transparent or invisible thread, so you can see the holes, but you can't actually see the thread itself. The bobbin thread is normal thread. You can see what the stitching looks like, and then you trim back the stabilizer. I wanted the constellations to pop out a little bit, so I used colored thread, but you see it's a lot less forgiving than the transparent thread is. A very helpful tool is a design wall, which is really just a large piece of felt with a 1-inch grid on it. Cotton fabric just sticks to this without any pins required. Now that the outside blocks are done, I have to move on to the hardest part of the quilt, which is the blue lights under the noodles. And I need to do that in a way that I minimize the risk. So I'm going to do it first, and I'm going to keep it separate from the rest of the quilt. I do this by fusing it to the stabilizer instead of fabric, and I use a blue fabric pencil to draw the outline for the blue lights. And my first experiment was to use a satin stitch, and that was a terrible failure because it was too angular and not very organic. Another thing I tried was using this cool blue sparkly tulle fabric and then did free motion stitching over it, and I found that it didn't add anything to the process that I didn't just get from free motion stitching, so that's what I ended up doing. I used invisible thread to applique the sheikah motif at the top, and I just sewed in the small constellations using free motion stitching and colored thread. My next step was to fuse and to sew with invisible thread all the elements of the base, including link. And finally, I cut away the excess stabilizer and sewed on the noodles. Now that the individual blocks are done, you step back and say, is this the way I want to sew it together? And I decide to rearrange the corners so that the divine beasts match the order I did them in the game. So then you just sew the blocks together, and you're ready to move on to quilting. You always cut your fabric back and batting larger than your quilt top itself, and I put those two pieces together using this spray adhesive quilt basting spray. I use it to put the top on as well, but then I also put pins in it to hold it together even more securely. And then you're ready to quilt them together. Now I use two types of quilting stitches. I stitched in the ditch, which is straight stitching along the piecing seams, and I used free motion echo quilting around the center motif and the designs on the side blocks. You can see the echo quilting here is just repeated outlines around the shape. And then the most hair-raising part is you have to get out your quilt ruler and cut off those overflow edges of the batting and the backing. The final step is to sew the binding fabric on the front of the quilt, and this is what it looks like when it's attached to the front, but then you turn it to the back and you hand sew it on, and your quilt is basically finished. I usually add a hanging sleeve at the top. At the left here is the drawing that came out of Illustrator, and the right is the actual quilt as it's finished. And here in the center is the reference photo that started it all, and I really love how this turned out. I like how this project shows how high-tech tools and traditional techniques can work very well together. I have lots of other fun projects I'm working on, so if you're interested, please subscribe to my YouTube channel.